a continent that lost the horse and the empire that brought it back.
Before we talk about cowboys, before we talk about ranches, lariats, saddles, and dust-filled sunsets, we need to begin with something deeper, something almost unbelievable. Because the story of the American West does not begin with America. It begins with an animal. And the truth is, North America was once the birthplace of the horse. Long before Spain, long before the United States, long before Mexico, long before even written language existed on this continent, horses ran wild here. Their ancestors evolved on these plains. Their hooves carved paths through prehistoric grasslands. Their herds shaped ecosystems the way bison later would. In a strange twist of fate, the horse was not a foreign creature to North America at all. It was native. But then the world changed. Around the end of the last ice age, thousands upon thousands of years ago, North America underwent a transformation. The climate shifted, environments changed, large animals disappeared, and among them, the horse vanished. For reasons still debated, whether overhunting, ecological collapse, disease, or the chain reaction of a changing planet, horses went extinct on the continent that had once produced them. And so for millennia, the land remained without the animal that seemed designed for it. The Great Plains had no hooves. The deserts had no mounted riders. The vast spaces of North America had no creature that could turn distance into nothing. And then, in the late 15th century, a new force appeared on the horizon, an empire driven by exploration, faith, ambition, and conquest. Spain. When Spain entered the age of discovery, it did not come as a blank slate. It came as a civilization already shaped by centuries of war, frontier life, and horsemanship. Spain did not simply bring ships and steel to the New World. Spain brought a riding culture. Spain brought cavalry tradition. Spain brought a relationship with the horse that was deeply embedded into its identity. To understand why Spain would reshape North America so completely, we must understand Spain itself, because Spain was not like other European kingdoms. Spain was forged in the furnace of frontier struggle. For centuries, the Iberian Peninsula had been a contested land where kingdoms rose and fell, where borders shifted, where warfare demanded mobility and discipline. Spanish riders learned that a man on horseback was not merely a soldier. He was power. He was speed. He was command over the landscape. This was not the slow-moving warfare of medieval castles alone. Spain's history demanded something else, the ability to move fast, strike hard, and control territory. And in Spain, horsemanship became more than a skill. It became a culture. The horse became a symbol of status, nobility, and authority. Mounted men were not just fighters, they were elites, they were leaders. And the traditions that formed around Spanish riding, training methods, saddlery, breeding, discipline, would later become the blueprint for what the world would recognize as Western riding. But Spain did not only develop this culture in palaces and battlefields, it also developed it in the countryside. Spain was a land of herding, grazing, and livestock economy. Cattle, sheep, goats, these were not just food sources, they were wealth. And managing livestock on wide land required organization. It required movement. It required men who could ride, track, rope, and control animals larger than themselves. Spain's rural workers were not called cowboys, but the foundations of the cowboy job existed there. Men who lived on the edge of civilization. Men who rode for survival. Men who understood animals better than politics. Men who could turn chaos into order using only a rope, a horse, and experience. And this system, this ranching logic, would be exported across an ocean. Now imagine the moment Spain arrived in the Americas. It is easy to imagine cannons, armor, and flags. But we must picture something else. Horses stepping onto a continent that had not seen them in thousands of years. When the Spanish ships landed in the Caribbean, the horse was among the most astonishing sights imaginable. To people who had never seen such an animal, the mounted Spanish rider looked like something beyond human. A creature fused into one. A beast and a man moving as one body. And that first impression would echo across generations. The Spanish did not merely bring horses for show, they brought them because horses were tools of empire. Horses allowed Spain to travel farther inland, to patrol larger areas, to deliver messages, to transport supplies, to fight and dominate in ways foot soldiers could not. But what began as a military advantage quickly became something else, because horses breed. And once they began to multiply, the horse became more than a weapon. It became infrastructure. It became mobility. It became economy. It became culture. In the early decades of Spanish expansion, horses were introduced first in the islands and then gradually carried on to the mainland. And by the time Spanish expeditions pushed into Mexico and beyond, the horse was firmly planted into the New World. This is where the story becomes bigger than conquest. Because once horses exist in a land, they do not stay contained. They spread. Some escape, some are stolen, some are traded, some are captured, some reproduce in the wild. And slowly, almost inevitably, horses begin to move outward beyond Spanish control. In time, the horse would reach indigenous societies far from Spanish towns, and in many cases it transformed them completely, creating new forms of hunting, warfare, and trade. But we should not jump ahead too quickly. Because Spain's most important contribution to the American West was not simply the horse. It was the system that came with it. Spain was not bringing a random animal. Spain was bringing a civilization's relationship with the animal. And this relationship had rules, breeding traditions, riding techniques, training systems, equipment designs. And perhaps most importantly, Spain brought livestock. Spain brought cattle. Not wild buffalo, not deer, not elk. Cattle, domesticated, managed, branded, herded. And once cattle exist on a continent, you need a workforce to manage them. Cattle don't manage themselves. They wander. They scatter. They stampede. They require constant control. So Spain's empire did what empires always do. It created a frontier economy. And that economy required ranchers. Ranches required labor. Labor required riders. And riders required skill. This is the birthplace of what would later become the cowboy. Not in Texas. Not in Kansas. Not in Hollywood. But in the Spanish frontier. The Spanish were building a new world, and they were building it using the tools they already knew: horses, livestock, ranch systems, and mounted workers. In Spanish, a man who worked cattle from horseback had a name. Vaquero. From the word vaca, meaning cow. a cowman, a cattle hand. And this word matters more than people realize, because the cowboy was not invented in English. The cowboy was translated into English. This is a major point that your documentary should hammer with confidence, because when people imagine the cowboy, they imagine something purely American. But the cowboy is not a purely American invention. He is a cultural descendant. He is the inheritor of Spanish systems adapted through Mexico and shaped by frontier realities. The American cowboy was not born in isolation. He was born in a world already built by Spain. And the reason we can say that with certainty is simple. Look at the language. Look at the gear. Look at the methods. Look at the traditions. The rope itself, the lasso, comes from Spanish vocabulary. The rodeo comes from Spanish tradition. The ranch system has Spanish roots. The saddle, the spurs, the way cattle are worked, the way horses are trained, these things did not appear out of nowhere in the United States. They were imported. They were inherited. They were refined. And behind them stands a long chain of Spanish development. So when we say Spain reintroduced horses to North America, we must understand what that truly means. Spain did not simply bring back an extinct species. Spain reopened the continent to a new era of movement. Spain turned North America into a horse continent again. And with that return came an unstoppable transformation. Because once the horse returned, everything changed. Distance collapsed. Borders expanded. Power shifted. A man could ride 50 miles in a day. He could chase cattle across open land. He could outrun enemies. He could carry messages between settlements. He could patrol territory. He could hunt differently. He could fight differently. He could live differently. This is the true beginning of the cowboy age. Not as a myth. Not as a movie. But as a practical necessity. The horse returned. And with it, a new frontier economy became possible.
The Horse Kingdom of Europe.
If you want to understand how cowboy culture was born in North America, you cannot begin in America. You must begin in Spain. Because Spain was not simply another European kingdom that happened to arrive in the New World. Spain was a civilization already shaped by a long, violent, and uniquely demanding frontier history, one that made horsemanship essential. In many ways, Spain was Europe's training ground for mounted life. It was a land where the horse was not just transportation. It was survival. It was warfare. It was status. And eventually, it was identity. Spain's geography alone explains part of the story. Much of the Iberian Peninsula contains open plains, dry interior plateaus, rugged hills, and vast grazing regions. These are landscapes where a man on foot is slow and vulnerable, but a man on horseback is mobile, powerful, and dominant. In Spain, the horse did not become important because of fashion. It became important because the land demanded it. But geography is only the beginning. Spain's deeper horse tradition comes from centuries of conflict and shifting borders. For hundreds of years, Iberia was not stable. It was a contested region where different kingdoms fought for control and where military success depended on speed, coordination, and mobility. Spain was shaped by frontier warfare long before Spain was unified. And in frontier warfare, the horse is the ultimate advantage. Mounted troops can scout farther.
They can raid quickly. They can retreat fast.
They can strike and vanish. They can control open country in ways foot soldiers never can. This is the same logic that would later define the American West. But Spain learned it earlier.
Much earlier.
Over time, Spain's horsemanship evolved into a refined culture, and it became deeply tied to both the military and rural life. Spanish horse breeding became serious business, Iberian horses were prized, and Spain became known for producing strong, agile mounts. And here we must understand something critical. The Spanish did not just ride horses. They developed a system of riding that emphasized control, responsiveness, and discipline. A Spanish rider needed to do more than travel. He needed to manage an animal like a partner. He needed to direct it with precision.
And most importantly, he needed to keep his hands free.
Because the Spanish rider was often carrying weapons, tools, or rope. This is a key foundation of ranch culture. The horse is not just a vehicle. The horse is a working platform. And Spain mastered this idea. This is where the cultural roots of the cowboy begin. Not in a saloon, not in a duel, but in a working relationship between man and animal. Now, when people imagine medieval Europe, they imagine knights in armor charging in straight lines. But Spanish horsemanship developed differently. Spain was not only influenced by northern European traditions, it was shaped by the Mediterranean world, by cavalry tactics, and by centuries of contact with North Africa. This mattered because the riding culture that formed in Iberia leaned towards speed, agility, and tactical maneuvering, not just brute force. Spain's riders learned to turn quickly, to handle rough terrain, to ride in hot climates, and to operate for long distances. These skills are the same skills needed in ranch work. And Spain did not keep these traditions locked inside noble courts. They spread into the countryside, because Spain also had another major industry that demanded mounted expertise: livestock. Long before Spain crossed the Atlantic, Spain was already a herding civilization. Cattle were important, yes, but even more significant historically was Spain's massive sheep industry. Wool was wealth, wool was trade, wool was empire-building money. Herds were moved across regions, grazing lands were managed, and labor systems developed around animal movement. This is crucial because it created an entire workforce of rural animal handlers, men trained to live outdoors, follow herds, endure weather, and travel across wide spaces. The cowboy lifestyle is not an American invention. It is an ancient frontier profession.
Spain simply refined it.
And Spain built social systems around it. To manage herds, Spain needed riders. To manage riders, Spain needed discipline. And discipline created tradition. Tradition created techniques. Techniques created equipment. And equipment created the recognizable tools of ranch life: the saddle, the spur, the rope, the riding boot, the wide-brimmed hat. Many of these things, or their earliest ancestors, were already present in Spanish rural culture long before the word cowboy existed. This is why Spain's influence was not accidental. It was inevitable. Because Spain did not arrive in the New World empty-handed. Spain arrived with a fully developed livestock riding civilization. And that civilization was exportable. Now here is a powerful idea to emphasize in your documentary. Spain was not merely conquering land. Spain was exporting a way of life, an entire frontier operating system. Spain's empire wasn't just forts and kings. It was horses and ranches. It was cattle and workers. It was rope and saddle. And the Spanish were not improvising these things when they reached the Americas. They were applying centuries of knowledge. Spain had already solved the problem of managing animals on open land. Spain had already solved the problem of controlling distance. Spain had already solved the problem of using mounted labor to produce wealth. So when Spain reached the Americas, they did not simply introduce horses. They introduced the entire logic of the ranch.
And that is where the cowboy is born. Not in America.
In Spanish tradition. But the story becomes even more interesting when we look at Spain's social hierarchy. Because in Spain, the horse was tied to status. The mounted man was respected. He was not just a worker. He was seen as skilled, disciplined, and valuable. This matters because cowboy culture later becomes romanticized in America, seen as rugged, independent, and masculine. But those traits were already celebrated in Spain's horse culture. The Spanish rider was often viewed as an extension of Spain's identity, proud, fearless, self-reliant, capable. Even the Spanish language reflects this. Consider the word caballero. Today, in modern Spanish, it can mean gentleman. But historically, it comes from caballo, horse. A caballero is literally a horseman. In other words, in Spain, the very idea of a gentleman was tied to riding. This is not a small detail. This is the cultural DNA of the West. The cowboy becomes a cultural icon because he represents independence and strength. But Spain had already linked those qualities to the mounted man long before the American frontier even existed. Spain had already romanticized the horseman, and Spain had already built an empire around him. So when the Spanish later crossed the Atlantic, they brought not just horses, but a worldview. A worldview where land is conquered by mobility, where wealth is created by livestock, where discipline is created by riding, where a man's value is proven in dust, heat, and endurance. This is cowboy philosophy before cowboys. Now, let's go deeper. Spain also had one more crucial advantage: horse breeding. Spanish horses were not random animals. Spain developed bloodlines that emphasized strength, endurance, and agility. The Iberian horse became known for intelligence and responsiveness. And in frontier life, that matters more than beauty. A cowboy or a vaquero does not need a horse that looks pretty. He needs a horse that can work. A horse that can turn fast.
A horse that doesn't panic. A horse that can run long distances.
A horse that can survive harsh conditions. Spain's breeding traditions gave them the perfect tool to dominate open land. And so when Spain carried horses to the Americas, they were not bringing weak European farm horses. They were bringing animals built for riding culture.
Animals bred for control. Animals bred for war and work.
Animals that could handle the demands of a frontier. This is why Spanish horses spread so successfully. They weren't just present. They thrived, they reproduced, they adapted, they multiplied, and soon horses became a growing population in the New World. But Spain's riding culture was only half the story. The other half was livestock. Because Spain did not just bring horses to the Americas. Spain brought cattle, and cattle require ranching. Ranching requires land. Land requires control. Control requires riders. And riders require a tradition. Spain had all of this already. It was ready-made. And when Spain arrived in the Americas, the frontier became a stage where Spanish ranch culture could expand dramatically. In fact, the Americas offered something Spain itself could not: scale.
Spain returns the horse to the Americas.
The return of the horse to the Americas is one of the most dramatic reversals in human and natural history. An animal that evolved on North American soil vanished completely, wiped from the land for thousands of years. Then suddenly it returned, not by migration, not by evolution, but by ship. And it was Spain that carried it back. To understand the magnitude of what happened, imagine the New World before horses. Vast plains existed, but they were crossed slowly. Hunting was done on foot. Trade was done with human strength and pack animals like dogs. Warfare was close range and limited by distance. The land was huge, but human mobility was small. And Spain arrived with an animal that could shrink the continent. The earliest Spanish voyages after Columbus were not simply exploration missions. They were the beginning of colonization, and colonization required logistics, transport, food systems, and security. And that meant one thing: horses. In 1493, on Columbus's second voyage, Spanish ships began bringing horses to the Caribbean. These were not symbolic animals, they were strategic assets, part of Spain's plan to establish permanent presence. The Caribbean became the first staging ground, the first laboratory, the first place where Spain tested how European livestock could survive and multiply in American climates. And the results were powerful. Horses survived, they adapted, they reproduced, they thrived. And as Spanish settlements expanded, horses became a growing population in the New World. But the real turning point came when Spanish expeditions moved to the mainland. Because the Caribbean islands were important, but they were not the heart of the continent. The mainland was where the story becomes legendary. The year 1519 stands as one of the most significant dates in this narrative. Hernán Cortés arrived in Mexico bringing horses with him. Cortés did not arrive with thousands of horses. He arrived with a relatively small number, but the psychological and military impact of those animals was enormous. For indigenous peoples who had never seen a horse, the sight of a mounted man was shocking. The speed, the size, the coordination, the sound of hooves, the power of cavalry charges. It looked like supernatural force. And Spain used this advantage effectively. But we must be careful not to exaggerate the horse as the only reason Spain succeeded. Disease, alliances, internal conflicts, and weapons all played massive roles. Still, the horse mattered because the horse gave Spain something no one else had: mobility. And mobility is often the deciding factor on frontiers. In a world without horses, distance protects people. In a world with horses, distance becomes weakness, and Spain understood this immediately. The horse became Spain's tool of dominance, not just in battle, but in exploration. Horses allowed Spanish expeditions to push outward, to scout new territory, to establish supply routes, to travel quickly between settlements. The Spanish frontier expanded like a ripple, and wherever Spain went, horses went. But something else happened too, because horses are not machines. They are living creatures. They escape, they get stolen, they reproduce in the wild. And soon, horses began to spread beyond Spain's control. Some were lost during expeditions, some were abandoned, some were captured by indigenous groups, some were traded, and some simply multiplied in the growing ranch systems of New Spain. The result was inevitable. Horses began spreading across the continent. Spain had reintroduced them, but Spain could not contain them. This is where the story becomes larger than Spain's empire itself, because once horses began spreading, they became a continent-wide phenomenon. Indigenous societies, especially in the northern regions, eventually adopted horses and transformed their cultures around them. But the Spanish influence remained the spark. Spain was the match that lit the fire. And now another major factor enters the story, one that is just as important as the horse itself. Cattle. Spain did not just reintroduce horses, Spain introduced a livestock economy. Spanish colonization was not only about conquest, it was about building permanent wealth, and cattle were wealth that multiplied. If Spain could establish cattle ranching, Spain could create food supply, trade systems, and export economy. A ranch could sustain settlers, it could feed armies, it could produce leather, tallow, and meat. In other words, cattle could turn frontier land into profit. And Spain was not naive. They understood that livestock is empire-building material. So cattle were brought into the New World, and in the wide lands of New Spain, cattle populations grew fast. And once cattle exist, you have a new problem. How do you control them? Cattle are not like sheep. They are heavier, stronger, more dangerous. They can stampede, they can scatter across huge land. To control cattle in open range, Spain needed skilled mounted workers. This is where the vaquero begins to appear. At first, Spanish ranch work was done by a mix of Spanish settlers, indigenous labor, and later mixed communities that formed across New Spain. But over time, a specialized class of mounted cattle handlers developed, and their role was not glamorous. It was difficult, it was dangerous, it was exhausting. The vaquero was not a romantic figure in the beginning. He was a necessity, a working rider trained to handle cattle, manage herds, and survive the frontier. And he emerged because Spain created a ranch economy. Spain's ranch economy required mounted labor. Mounted labor required skills. Skills created traditions, and traditions became culture. This is the true process of cowboy formation, not through myth, through economics, through labor, through survival. Now, the vaqueros' culture did not form overnight. It took generations. But Spain had already provided the building blocks: horses, cattle, land grants and ranch systems, riding tradition, livestock management knowledge, tools and equipment design. Spain had the blueprint, the Americas provided the scale, and the vaquero became the living bridge between them. In this period, Spain also began building a frontier infrastructure that would define the West for centuries. Missions, presidios, ranchos. These were not isolated outposts, they were an organized frontier network. Spain used missions to spread religion and settlement, presidios to secure territory, ranchos to produce food and wealth. And this system expanded northward into regions that today include Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California. What we call the American West was, for a long time, Spanish territory, and it was being shaped not by American settlers but by Spanish colonial systems. This is where the Spanish bias of the narrative becomes powerful and historically justified. Because if you step back and look at the timeline, the American cowboy appears late. The Spanish vaquero appears early. The United States did not invent ranch culture in the Southwest. Spain planted it, Spain grew it, Mexico inherited it, and then the United States absorbed it. This is the sequence. This is the reality behind the legend. So when we imagine cowboys riding under wide skies, we are often imagining something American. But the earliest mounted cattle culture in the West was Spanish. The earliest ranch networks were Spanish. The earliest horse herds were Spanish-bred. The earliest roping traditions were Spanish-derived. And the earliest cowboy vocabulary was Spanish language. This is why the American cowboy cannot be separated from Spain, because Spain laid the foundation before America existed as a nation. Now, this chapter also introduces one of the most important themes of the entire documentary. The horse did not return to North America as a wild force. It returned as part of an imperial system. The horse was not simply a biological reintroduction, it was a cultural weapon, it was a technological advantage, it was an economic tool. And Spain understood its value immediately. Spain didn't bring horses for beauty. Spain brought horses because horses allowed empire. And as the horses multiplied, Spain's influence multiplied with them. Now, by the early 1500s, Spain had planted the seeds of what would become the West. The horse was back, cattle were spreading, ranches were forming, mounted workers were developing their craft, and the frontier was expanding northward. But the story does not end here. Because the next stage is where cowboy culture truly begins to take recognizable form. This is where the Spanish system becomes a tradition, where the vaquero becomes a professional identity, where ranching becomes a way of life, where equipment becomes standardized, where techniques become refined, where language becomes embedded into the land. And that stage happens in New Spain and especially Mexico. Because Mexico becomes the workshop where Spanish ranching culture evolves into the vaquero tradition that later defines the West. So in the next chapter we move into the heart of New Spain, not to battlefields, not to palaces, but to ranchos, to cattle ranges, to horse herds, to men whose lives were spent in dust and sun. Men who created the first true Western riding culture in the Americas, men who were not called cowboys. They were called vaqueros. And the vaquero was about to become the most influential working horseman in North American history. The horse had returned, the cattle had multiplied, the Spanish frontier had begun to stretch outward like an expanding horizon. But now came the real question. How do you build a civilization on open land? How do you control thousands of cattle across endless range? How do you turn wilderness into ranch country? Spain had the answer, and the answer was not a fort. It was not a cannon. It was not a ship. It was a man on horseback.
A vaquero.
In the next chapter, we enter the ranching world of New Spain. where the cowboy's true ancestor takes shape.
The birth of the vaquero.
If Spain reintroduced the horse to the Americas, then New Spain, especially Mexico, was the place where that horse became something greater than transportation. This is where the horse became culture. This is where ranching became a civilization.
And this is where the vaquero was born.
Because the vaquero was not created by theory, he was created by necessity. The Spanish Empire in the Americas was vast, and unlike Europe, the land here was not crowded. There were no centuries-old hedgerows dividing property, no compact villages every few miles, no dense network of roads and castles. Instead, there were enormous open spaces, grassland stretching farther than the eye could see, deserts wide enough to swallow entire expeditions, mountain valleys untouched by European settlement. Spain, this land represented opportunity, but opportunity required organization. Spain could not simply claim territory by drawing lines on a map. Spain had to make the land productive, and the most direct way to do that was livestock. Cattle were the frontier's gold. Not the romantic kind of gold, but the practical kind, the kind that feeds people, supplies armies, produces leather, and creates trade networks. And once Spain began raising cattle in large numbers, a new reality emerged. Cattle multiplied rapidly in the Americas. The land was vast. Predators existed, but the herds grew anyway. The open range allowed cattle to spread outward across thousands of miles. Within a few generations, cattle ranching in New Spain became enormous. But the more cattle spread, the more they became difficult to control. And here is where the vaquero enters history. Because cattle ranching on open land is not a gentle business.
Cattle do not stay neatly organized.
They wander, they scatter, they fight,
They stampede.
they disappear into brush. They break fences, and in early ranching, fences were limited. To manage cattle across huge distances, you need riders, not casual riders.
Not occasional horsemen.
You need professional mounted livestock handlers,
Men whose entire lives are built around the movement of animals. Men who understand herd behavior.
men who can read tracks, weather, and terrain.
Men who can chase a runaway bull for miles, rope it, control it, and bring it back alive.
This is not a skill learned in a weekend. This is a profession. And in Spanish America, that profession was called vaquero. The word comes from vaca, cow.
A vaquero is literally a cowman.
But the word is more than a translation. It represents a complete frontier identity. A vaquero was not simply a ranch worker. He was a master of a new world. Because New Spain was creating a new frontier society, and the vaquero became one of its most important figures. Now here is where the Spanish bias becomes historically powerful. Because when people imagine the cowboy, they imagine Texas. But the vaquero existed long before the American cowboy did. The vaquero was already riding, roping, branding, and driving cattle in Spanish territory, while the English colonies on the Atlantic coast were still relatively small and coastal. This means that the ranch culture most people associate with the American West was already developing under Spanish influence before the United States was even born.
This is not an opinion.
This is timeline reality. The American cowboy is a later chapter. The vaquero is the earlier foundation. And the vaquero did not appear as a romantic character. He appeared as a labor solution. Because the Spanish ranch system needed a specialized workforce. And that workforce evolved into a distinct culture with its own skills, its own tools, its own pride, and its own traditions. Now, what did the vaquero actually do? His job was to manage cattle in open range. That meant riding long distances daily, It meant tracking missing animals. It meant rounding up herds for branding.
It meant protecting livestock from predators and thieves.
It meant moving cattle between grazing grounds. It meant managing water sources. It meant handling dangerous bulls. And perhaps most importantly, it meant mastering rope work.
Roping was not entertainment. Roping was survival.
In open-range ranching, you cannot simply walk up to a wild cow and guide it like a pet. You must control it from a distance, and the rope is the tool that makes that possible. This is why rope culture became central to vaquero identity, and this is also why Spanish influence is so visible in cowboy culture today. Because the rope, lasso, comes from Spanish language. The practice of roping cattle becomes the foundation of later rodeo sports. The entire concept of mounted livestock control becomes the DNA of the cowboy world. Now, the vaquero was also responsible for branding cattle. Branding is one of the most iconic practices of ranch life, but it was not invented for drama. It was invented for ownership. Because cattle wandered across open land, ranchers needed a way to mark them. Brands became a legal and economic necessity. And this is where ranching becomes more than farming. It becomes a frontier economy. The ranch is not a small farm. It is a wide territory operation.
It is an industry.
And the vaquero is the frontline worker of that industry. Now, vaqueros also developed specialized equipment to make their work possible. Because working cattle from horseback requires more than a normal riding saddle. It requires stability. It requires strength. It requires the ability to handle rope tension without the rider being pulled off the horse. This is where the Western saddle begins to emerge as a working tool. The saddle horn, in particular, becomes one of the most iconic pieces of cowboy equipment. The horn allows the rider to wrap the rope and control cattle with leverage. This is not a decorative feature. It is a technology. And the vaquero tradition helped refine it into the form that later becomes standard in Western riding. In other words, the cowboy saddle is not an American invention in isolation. It is an evolution of Spanish frontier equipment. Now think about what this means. The vaquero was not just riding horses. He was shaping the horse. Because a working ranch horse must be trained differently than a war horse or a carriage horse. A ranch horse must learn to stay calm around cattle. It must learn to stop quickly. It must learn to turn fast. It must learn to respond to subtle cues. It must learn endurance. It must be intelligent. And so the vaquero became not only a cattle handler, but a horse trainer. This is another important piece of cowboy culture that begins in Spanish America. The relationship between horse and rider becomes almost legendary. A good vaquero does not merely sit on a horse. He communicates with it. He trusts it. He depends on it. And over time, vaquero culture produces a deep understanding of animal behavior, both cattle and horses. This is why later American cowboys, when they entered these territories, often learned directly from vaqueros.
Because vaqueros already had the knowledge.
They already had the techniques. They already had the traditions. The Americans did not create the ranching system from scratch.
They inherited it.
Now we must also talk about social structure. Because the vaquero was part of a complex frontier society. Spanish America was not purely Spanish in bloodline. It was a blend of Spanish settlers, indigenous peoples, mixed communities, and later others who entered the system. Vaqueros were often mestizo, people of mixed ancestry. And this is important because it reveals a truth that Hollywood often erases. The cowboy world was not purely Anglo. The cowboy world was multicultural from the beginning. But the cultural framework, the techniques, the language, the ranch system itself was Spanish-derived. Spain set the model, and Mexico became the heartland where that model evolved. This is why the vaquero is the central ancestor of cowboy culture, because the vaquero represents the first true Western rider in North America.
Not a European cavalryman.
Not a medieval knight, but a mounted livestock worker operating in open-range conditions. That is the essence of the cowboy profession, and the vaquero mastered it first. Now, there is another key detail to emphasize. Vaqueros were not only skilled, they were disciplined. They had rules, they had codes of behavior. They had traditions passed down through apprenticeship. A young man did not become a vaquero by simply owning a horse. He became one by learning under experienced riders. He learned rope work. He learned horse handling. He learned how to read cattle. He learned how to survive on long rides. He learned how to navigate deserts and mountains. He learned how to ride with confidence and authority. And this created a culture of pride. The vaquero became more than a laborer. He became an identity. He became the symbol of frontier skill. And this is where the cowboy myth begins, because the myth is built on something real. The cowboy is admired because the job is hard. The cowboy is admired because the skills are rare. The cowboy is admired because the lifestyle is dangerous and demanding. But those qualities existed first in the vaquero. The vaquero was the original frontier horseman of North America. And this is why Spanish influence cannot be ignored. Because without Spain, there is no vaquero. Without the vaquero, there is no cowboy culture. And without cowboy culture, the American West would not exist in the form we recognize today. Now, as New Spain's ranching economy expanded, it spread northward. Cattle herds moved into the northern frontier. Ranchos formed in regions that would later become Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, and California. Spanish missions and presidios became centers of livestock production. The frontier economy was growing, and with it, the vaquero tradition expanded like a living organism. Each new ranch required riders. Each new cattle herd required rope skill. Each new frontier settlement required horse knowledge. And so vaquero culture moved north. Not as an isolated profession, but as a traveling tradition. A tradition carried by men, horses, and cattle. This is where the vaquero becomes the first true architect of the West, because the vaquero was shaping the land. He was shaping animal populations. He was shaping economic networks. He was shaping the very geography of frontier civilization. And as the vaquero tradition spread northward, it began to lay the foundation for the next stage of the story. Because the farther north Spain expanded, the closer it came to future American territory. The closer it came to the places where English-speaking settlers would later arrive. And when they arrived, they would encounter a frontier already developed, already equipped,
Already organized. Already running on Spanish ranch logic.
This is where the American cowboy story begins to overlap with the Spanish story. And in the next chapter, we will follow that expansion northward into Texas, California, and the broader Southwest. Because Spanish ranching culture did not remain in Mexico. It moved north. And when it did, it carried the vaquero tradition into the heart of what would later become the American West. The cowboy, as the world would later know him, was being prepared. Not by Americans, but by Spanish frontier civilization. Transition to Chapter 5. By now, the Spanish Empire had done something extraordinary.
Northward expansion.
By the time most people imagine the American West, they picture something that feels uniquely American. Texas cattle drives, frontier towns, wide open plains, and rugged riders. But here is the historical truth that changes everything. The West did not begin as an American project. The West was already taking shape under Spanish influence long before the United States expanded into it. And the reason is simple. Spain moved north, not just with soldiers, not just with priests, but with cattle, horses, ranches, and vaqueros. As Spain consolidated control over Mexico, it began pushing outward into the northern frontier. And the northern frontier was not a thin strip of land. It was enormous. It included deserts, mountains, grasslands, and river valleys stretching across what is now northern Mexico and the American Southwest. Spain's presence expanded into Texas, into New Mexico, into Arizona, into California. These lands would later become part of the United States, but for centuries they were Spanish territory. And Spanish territory came with Spanish systems. When Spain established missions and presidios, it was not only planting flags, it was planting infrastructure. And one of the most important pieces of that infrastructure was livestock. Because frontier settlements needed food, they needed trade goods, they needed wealth, they needed a reason to survive, and cattle provided all of it. Missions often became centers of ranching production. They raised cattle and horses, developed grazing lands, and required labor forces capable of managing large herds. That meant vaqueros, and so as Spain moved north, vaqueros moved north. The vaquero was not confined to Mexico. He became a frontier professional, traveling wherever cattle ranching expanded. This is how Spanish ranch culture migrated into Texas and California, and once it arrived, it became deeply rooted. Now, Texas is a key part of this story because Texas later becomes the symbolic heart of cowboy mythology. But before Texas was American, it was part of the Spanish frontier world. Spanish ranching traditions shaped the region's early livestock economy. Spanish horses moved through the region, Spanish cattle herds expanded, Spanish language shaped place names and ranch vocabulary. And vaqueros became the first true mounted cattle workers of the Texas frontier. This is crucial. Because when Americans later entered Texas, they did not enter an empty land waiting for ranching to be invented. They entered a land where ranching already existed, where cattle were already raised, where horses were already part of life, where mounted cattle handling techniques were already developed, where vaqueros already understood the land. And when Americans encountered this world, they adopted it, they learned from it, they borrowed from it, they translated it. And over time, the Spanish-based ranching system became absorbed into an English-speaking frontier economy. This is where the cowboy emerges, as an English-language version of the vaquero, not as a separate invention, as an adaptation. But California's story is equally important, and in some ways even more revealing. Because California became one of the most influential regions in shaping the ranching identity of the West, and California's ranching tradition was deeply Spanish. Spanish missions in California raised huge herds of cattle. These missions required vast grazing lands, and they required skilled riders to manage livestock across open country. California's ranchos became legendary. Large land grants created a ranch economy where cattle were central. And in this world, the vaquero was not only a worker, he was a master of the land. The vaquero tradition in California became highly developed. It produced expert riders, ropers, horse trainers, and cattle handlers. California vaqueros became famous for their riding skill, their horsemanship, and their techniques. In many ways, California was one of the purest examples of Spanish ranch civilization in North America. And the influence did not end there, because California ranching culture later shaped American ranching culture when the region became part of the United States. This is one of the most important moments in the Cowboy story. When the United States absorbed Spanish and Mexican territories, it absorbed not just land, but ranch systems. It absorbed vaquero traditions. It absorbed Spanish vocabulary. It absorbed the techniques that made cattle ranching possible. And those techniques would later become the foundation of the American cattle industry. Now, this is something very important to understand. The cowboy is not the origin of Western ranching. The cowboy is the inheritor of Western ranching. The cowboy appears later, the vaquero appears earlier, and the reason the vaquero appears earlier is because Spain arrived earlier. Spain developed the frontier ranch system earlier. Spain expanded into these territories earlier. Spain built a cattle economy earlier. This is the Spanish advantage in history. Spain was first. Now, we should also talk about the physical landscape and how it shaped ranch culture, because the Southwest is not like Europe. The Southwest is harsh, dry, wide, unforgiving. Water is limited, heat is intense, distances are enormous. And these conditions created a particular kind of frontier rider. A rider who could endure, a rider who could travel long distances, a rider who could survive with minimal resources, a rider who could work cattle across rugged terrain. The vaquero tradition adapted to these conditions, and that adaptation created many of the defining characteristics of cowboy culture. For example, clothing evolved not for fashion, but for protection. Leg protection became important in brush and thorny landscapes. Wide-brimmed hats became necessary for sun. Boots became essential for long riding. Spurs became useful for precise horse control. These things later become iconic cowboy symbols. But they were not invented for style. They were invented for survival. And the earliest versions of them existed in Spanish frontier culture. Now, here is where we must highlight the deep cultural connection between Spain and the American West. Because Spanish frontier culture did not simply create ranching techniques, it created a way of thinking, a frontier philosophy, a philosophy of independence, of endurance, of honor tied to skill. The vaquero tradition carried a sense of pride. A vaquero was judged by his ability, his rope work, his riding control, his courage around dangerous cattle, his ability to handle chaos calmly. These values later become central to cowboy mythology. But again, cowboy mythology did not invent them. Vaquero culture embodied them first. This is why Spain's influence goes beyond animals and tools. It reaches into identity, into psychology, into what the West meant as an idea. Now, we also need to understand how cattle became wealth in the Spanish frontier. In Spanish and Mexican ranch culture, cattle were not always raised primarily for meat. In many cases, cattle were valued for hides and tallow. Leather could be traded, tallow could be used for candles and soap, hides could be shipped and sold. Cattle became a frontier commodity. And because cattle herds multiplied quickly, ranching became one of the most profitable economic systems in Spanish America. This is another reason why ranching spread northward. Spain was not expanding ranching culture because it looked romantic. Spain was expanding it because it generated wealth. Ranching was frontier capitalism, and the vaquero was its labor engine. Now, this is where we introduce the concept of cultural inheritance. Because when American settlers later moved into Texas and California, they often imagined themselves as pioneers entering wild land. But the truth is, much of the ranching infrastructure was already present. The techniques for working cattle already existed. The horse training methods already existed. The equipment already existed. Even the vocabulary already existed. Americans did not invent the ranch, they adopted it. And when Americans adopted it, they also adopted Spanish words, and language is evidence that cannot be denied. If American cowboy culture was purely invented by Americans, why does it use Spanish terms? Why do so many cowboy words come from Spanish? Why does the ranch itself have Spanish roots? Why does rodeo have Spanish roots? Why does lasso have Spanish roots? Why does bronco have Spanish roots? Why do we find Spanish influence in everything from horse gear to cattle techniques? The answer is clear. Because Spanish culture was the original foundation of ranch life in the West. The American cowboy is not a separate species. He is a translated vaquero. Now, we must be careful here. This is not to say the American cowboy is fake, not at all. The American cowboy became his own identity, shaped by new economic forces, especially the rise of railroads, beef markets, and Anglo-American expansion. But the cowboy did not appear from nothing. He appeared in a region already shaped by Spain and Mexico. He emerged from a system already established, and the vaquero was the master of that system. Now we must also emphasize the movement of horses themselves. Spanish horses did not remain confined to ranches. They spread across open land. Some became feral. Wild horse populations began to grow. And these wild horses, later called mustangs, became a symbol of the West. But even the mustang carries Spanish origin. The mustang is not a purely American animal. It is the descendant of Spanish horses. In other words, even the wild horse of the West is a Spanish legacy. So by the time Spanish ranching culture had spread northward, the West was already developing its identity. The horse was central, cattle were central, ranches were expanding, vaqueros were working the land. Spanish language was embedded into frontier vocabulary, and the Spanish Empire had created a ranch civilization stretching across a massive part of North America. But history is never stable. Empires shift, borders change. Mexico gained independence. Spanish territories became Mexican territories, and then later large portions of those territories became American. And when those transitions happened, the ranch system did not disappear. The ranch system remained, the cattle herds remained, the horses remained, the vaqueros remained. And the Americans who arrived inherited a ready-made frontier economy. This is where the cowboy story begins to accelerate, because once the United States enters the Southwest, It begins adapting this Spanish-Mexican ranch world into its own economic system, and the result is what the world eventually calls the cowboy era. Coming up next, we dive into the gear and techniques themselves. We examine how vaquero technology became cowboy iconography. Because what Americans later wore, rode, and used was not invented in a vacuum. It was inherited from Spanish frontier innovation. The cowboy's world was built from Spanish tools, and those tools shaped the West.
Ropes, saddles and spurs.
When people think of the cowboy, they often imagine a silhouette. A man on horseback, a wide-brimmed hat, boots, spurs, a coiled rope hanging from the saddle, leather chaps flapping in the wind. It feels like a purely American image, but if you strip away the mythology and look at the reality, the cowboy's most iconic gear is not a random invention. It is a toolkit, a working system. And that system is deeply connected to Spanish and vaquero tradition, because cowboy equipment did not evolve as fashion, it evolved as frontier engineering. And the vaqueros of Spanish America were among the first in North America to develop and refine the tools needed for mounted livestock control. In other words, before the cowboy became a symbol, the vaquero became a technician, and the West was shaped by his equipment. Let's begin with the most important tool of all, the rope. In the American imagination, the lasso is one of the cowboy's defining weapons. But in reality, it is not a weapon. It is a device for controlling livestock. And its roots are Spanish. The very word lasso comes from Spanish. The concept of controlling animals from horseback with a looped rope is ancient, but Spain carried this tradition into the Americas, where it became essential to ranch life. A vaquero could not rely on fences to control cattle. Open-range ranching meant cattle roamed freely across huge distances. So when cattle needed to be gathered, sorted, branded, or moved, the rope became the tool that allowed one rider to control an animal many times his size. This is not just a trick, it is physics. A rope allows distance. A rope allows leverage. A rope allows control without direct contact. In a world of wild cattle, the rope is civilization, and the vaquero became a master of it. In fact, roping skill became one of the defining measures of a vaquero's reputation. A man could be judged by the speed and accuracy of his throw, by his ability to rope a running animal, by his control of the rope tension, by his ability to bring an animal down without injuring it, because a good vaquero did not simply catch cattle, he managed them. Now consider what happens next. Once roping becomes central to ranch work, equipment begins to evolve around it. This is where the saddle becomes revolutionary. Because a normal riding saddle is not designed to withstand the force of a rope catching a running bull. If a rider ropes a cow at full speed, the rope can pull violently. It can jerk the horse, jerk the rider, and even drag a man to death if the rope is tangled. So the saddle had to evolve into a working platform. It needed stability, it needed strength, it needed design features that supported roping. This is where the Western saddle begins to emerge. The Western saddle is not simply a comfortable chair. It is a tool. It distributes weight for long riding. It supports the rider for hours. It stabilizes the rider during sudden movements. And most importantly, it includes a feature that defines Western riding more than anything else, the saddle horn. The horn is one of the most iconic objects in cowboy culture. But its purpose is entirely practical, It allows a rider to wrap the rope around it after catching cattle. This creates friction and leverage. The rider can then control the animal's movement, slow it down, and hold it steady. The horn transforms the horse and rider into a mechanical system, a living machine. And this is the point where cowboy culture becomes technological. The horse is the engine, the rope is the cable, the saddle horn is the winch, the rider is the operator. This is ranching technology, and Vaqueros refined it long before Anglo-American cowboys popularized it. Now we move to another iconic element, spurs. In modern pop culture, spurs are associated with swagger. A cowboy walks into a saloon and his spurs jingle dramatically. But in reality, spurs are not for drama, they are for precision. A spur is a communication tool between rider and horse. In ranch work, a rider must control a horse with minimal movement. Often, the rider's hands are busy holding rope, reins, or equipment, so leg cues become crucial. Spurs allow a rider to send clear signals to the horse without pulling on the reins constantly. They allow subtle control. They allow speed adjustments. They allow turning commands. And spurs have deep roots in Spanish riding culture. The vaquero did not use spurs because they looked impressive. He used them because cattle work demanded them. Now, boots. Cowboy boots are famous worldwide. The pointed toe, the high heel, the leather design, it has become a symbol of the West. But the boot is not a fashion invention either. Its high heel is practical. It helps keep the foot from slipping through the stirrup. That is not a small detail, because slipping through a stirrup can kill a rider. If a cowboy falls and his foot gets caught, he can be dragged across the ground by the horse. This is one of the most dangerous accidents in riding. The boot's heel helps prevent that. It is a safety feature, and the pointed toe helps the foot slide easily into the stirrup. Again, this is frontier engineering. A cowboy boot is a work boot designed for riding, and the tradition of specialized riding boots existed in Spanish riding culture long before it became iconic in America. Now let's talk about another essential piece of gear, chaps. Chaps are often viewed as part of cowboy costume, but the truth is, chaps are armor. They protect the legs from brush, thorns, cactus, and harsh terrain. In the Southwest, this is essential. Ride through mesquite and thorn scrub without protection, and your legs will be shredded. Chaps allow riders to move through harsh environments safely. They also protect against rope burns and cattle kicks. Chaps were not invented for show. They were invented because the frontier was brutal, and the vaquero tradition in Spanish America developed these protective garments as part of everyday ranch work. Now, hats. The cowboy hat is perhaps the most famous symbol of all. Wide brim, tall crown, shadowed face. But again, the cowboy hat exists because the environment demanded it. The sun in the Southwest is intense. Heat and glare can blind a rider. A wide brim protects the face and neck. It provides shade. It reduces exhaustion. It prevents sunburn. And in a land where riders spend entire days outdoors, this is not optional. It is survival. The exact style of hat evolved over time, but wide-brimmed headwear for frontier work existed early in Spanish ranch culture. Now, beyond clothing and gear, the vaqueros developed riding techniques that became fundamental to cowboy culture. One of the most important was one-handed riding. A working rider needs one hand free to throw rope, to manage cattle, to open gates, to carry tools. So the horse must be trained to respond to leg pressure, weight shifts, and subtle rein cues. This creates a riding style different from European military riding. The vaquero style emphasizes control and responsiveness. The horse becomes almost an extension of the rider's body. This is why Western riding is so distinctive. It is built for labor, and the vaquero perfected it. Now we must talk about another major concept, the horse itself. Because vaquero culture did not only influence tools, it influenced the breeding and training of horses. The horses used in ranch work needed specific traits: endurance, speed, agility, calm temperament, and intelligence. A ranch horse must not panic when a bull charges. It must not freeze when cattle stampede. It must respond instantly to rider commands. So vaqueros became expert horse trainers. And over time, Spanish America developed horse populations adapted to ranching. This is where the Mustang story becomes important, because Mustangs are often imagined as a wild symbol of American freedom, but Mustangs are descendants of Spanish horses. In other words, even the wild horse of the West is a Spanish legacy. This is a perfect example of Spain's hidden influence, because the American West is full of symbols people assume are purely American, but many of them are Spanish by origin. The Mustang, the lasso, the rodeo, the ranch, the bronco, the saddle horn. These are not random. They are evidence. They are fingerprints. Now let's talk about rodeo itself. Today, rodeo is a sport, a spectacle, entertainment. But originally, rodeo was work. It was ranch life. It was cattle handling turned into competition. The word rodeo comes from Spanish, meaning a gathering or roundup. And that is exactly what it originally was, which is a roundup of cattle. A ranch event where cattle were gathered, sorted, branded, and counted. These were essential economic events. But they also became opportunities for vaqueros to demonstrate skill, to show off roping ability, to show horse control, to show bravery. Over time, these ranch gatherings evolved into cultural events and later into organized rodeo competitions. So the modern rodeo is not a purely American creation. It is a descendant of Spanish ranch practices. Now let's talk about something subtle but important. The cowboy's entire relationship with cattle is shaped by vaquero practice. The way cattle are driven, the way cattle are roped, the way cattle are branded and sorted, even the way cattle are psychologically managed. These techniques did not spontaneously appear in Texas. They were developed over generations in Spanish America. They were tested in harsh environments. They were refined into tradition, and then they were inherited by later ranchers. This is why the vaquero should be viewed as the first great engineer of the West. Not because he built buildings, but because he built systems. He built methods, he built practices, he built tools, he built an entire working technology for frontier ranch life. And this technology was so effective that it survived every political change. Spain lost territories, Mexico gained independence, borders shifted, but the ranch system remained. Because cattle work is not political. Cattle work is practical. A rope works regardless of flag. A saddle works regardless of language. A skilled rider is valuable regardless of empire. So, even when the United States absorbed these lands, it also absorbed vaquero ranch technology. And this is where cowboy iconography is born. Because once Anglo-American settlers began ranching in Texas and California, they adopted the vaquero toolkit. They adopted the saddle style, they adopted roping methods, they adopted spurs, chaps, and ranch vocabulary. And then, in the late 1800s, when American cattle drives expanded, this inherited vaquero toolkit became associated with the English-speaking cowboy. This is why the cowboy looks the way he does, not because Americans invented a new style, but because they adopted a proven Spanish frontier system. The cowboy is often treated as a uniquely American figure. But the cowboy's equipment tells a different story, because every rope, every saddle horn, every spur, every ranch word is a reminder that the West was not created in isolation. It was inherited, and the inheritance came through Spain. By the mid-1800s, the West was no longer just a Spanish frontier. Borders were shifting, empires were fading. The United States was expanding aggressively into lands once shaped by Spain and Mexico. And in this collision of worlds, the ranch system did not disappear, it grew. Because American industry discovered what Spain had known for centuries, the West was perfect for cattle.
How Spanish ranch culture became an American industry.
By the mid-1800s, the West was changing faster than any frontier in modern history. The Spanish Empire that once ruled vast stretches of North America had faded. Mexico had emerged as an independent nation, and then, through war, diplomacy, and expansion, the United States absorbed huge territories that had once been Spanish and Mexican. Texas, California, New Mexico, Arizona, and beyond. This was the moment when the American West began to take the shape that would later dominate global imagination. But what many people fail to realize is this. When the United States moved into these lands, it did not discover an empty wilderness. It discovered a functioning ranch world, a world of cattle, a world of horses, a world of ranchos, a world of vaqueros, a world of Spanish vocabulary and Spanish-derived techniques already embedded into the soil. The United States did not invent Western ranching, it inherited it, and then it industrialized it. This is one of the most important transitions in the entire cowboy story, because the cowboy becomes famous not because ranching was new, but because ranching became massive, it became commercial, it became part of a booming national economy. And when an industry grows big enough, it creates legends. Now, what triggered this transformation? The answer is simple: demand. As American cities grew, especially in the East, the demand for beef increased. Industrialization and population growth created markets hungry for food. Meat was no longer a luxury for the wealthy, it was becoming a staple. But the eastern states could not easily produce enough cattle to feed the rising population. The solution was obvious: the West. The Great Plains and Southwest offered enormous grazing lands, land that seemed endless, land where cattle could multiply and fatten on grass. But there was one problem. The cattle were in the West. The markets were in the East. And between them lay thousands of miles of distance. So the question became, how do you move cattle across a continent? This is where the cowboy era truly begins. Not in a duel, not in a saloon, but in logistics. The cattle drive was not romantic, it was economic necessity. Herds had to be driven north and east toward railheads, where they could be shipped to cities and slaughterhouses. And to drive a herd of cattle across open range required riders. Skilled riders. Riders who could control stampedes, track strays, protect the herd, and survive months in the open. This is where the cowboy becomes essential. But once again, we must recognize the deeper truth. The techniques needed for cattle driving already existed. They had been developed in Spanish America for generations. The vaquero tradition had already solved the basic problem of mounted cattle control. The United States simply scaled the system up. The cowboy was born in the industrial expansion of a Spanish-rooted ranch culture. Now Texas becomes central here, because Texas was one of the greatest cattle-producing regions in North America. cattle herds multiplied across the Texas grasslands, and after the Civil War, Texas cattle became a major economic resource. But Texas cattle were far from eastern markets, so cattle drives became a national phenomenon. Cowboys drove herds northward along famous routes toward railheads in Kansas and beyond. And suddenly the cowboy became the face of the West. But let's pause, because we must ask, who taught Americans to do this? Who provided the techniques? Who had already mastered cattle work? The answer leads back to Spanish and Mexican ranch culture. Because in Texas and the Southwest, many of the earliest cattle handlers were Mexican vaqueros, they were already skilled. They already knew roping. They already knew branding. They already knew horse training. Anglo-American settlers learned from them. In many cases, they hired them. In many cases, they depended on them. So, even as the cowboy era exploded into American history, the Spanish influence remained beneath the surface, quiet, foundational, and undeniable. Now, this is where your documentary should emphasize a powerful irony. The cowboy became a symbol of American identity, but the cowboy's profession was built on Spanish tradition. The cowboy became an American icon, but the cowboy's tools, vocabulary, and methods were inherited. The cowboy was a cultural descendant of the vaquero, and yet American popular culture often erased that origin. Hollywood later painted the cowboy as purely Anglo-American. But the historical reality is more complex. The West was multicultural. The cowboy world included Anglo settlers, Mexican vaqueros, indigenous horse cultures, black cowboys, and others. But the operating system and the ranching foundation was Spanish. Spain had planted it centuries earlier. Now the cattle boom also transformed the cowboy into a distinct labor figure. Because the cowboy's life was not glamorous, it was hard labor. It meant long days in the saddle. It meant sleeping outdoors. It meant enduring storms, heat, and cold. It meant dealing with cattle diseases, injuries, and dangers. It meant riding through hostile terrain. It meant isolation. The cowboy was not a wealthy man. Most cowboys were wage workers. They were employees of ranch owners. Their job was physically brutal. And yet their skills were admired. Why? Because controlling cattle on open range requires courage. A stampede can kill, a charging bull can kill, a fall from a horse can kill, a rope wrapped wrong can kill. A cowboy's job demanded constant alertness and competence, and that is why the cowboy became mythologized. Because in a modern industrial society, the cowboy represented something rare. A man who survived by skill, not by comfort. A man who faced danger as routine. A man who lived on the edge of civilization. But again, that image existed earlier in the vaquero tradition. The cowboy was not the first frontier horseman. He was simply the one who became famous during America's expansion era. Now, another major factor enters the story here. Railroads. Railroads changed everything. Because railroads allowed cattle to be shipped efficiently to distant markets. Once cattle could reach eastern cities, the West became economically connected to the entire nation. The railroad turned cattle into industrial profit, and it turned the cowboy into an essential worker of a national supply chain. The cowboy was no longer just a ranch laborer. He was part of America's expanding industrial economy. The cowboy became a moving link between frontier land and modern markets. And as cattle drives became more common, the cowboy became more visible. Cowboys arrived in towns. Cowboys spent wages in saloons. Cowboys became characters in local stories. Journalists wrote about them. Writers turned them into legends. And soon the cowboy became a national symbol. But we must not confuse the symbol with the origin. The cowboy was a late-stage outcome, a final form. The roots still ran deep into Spanish frontier tradition. Now consider the words Americans used during the cattle boom. Many of them were Spanish. Rodeo, lasso, bronco, mustang, corral, stampede, ranch. Even buckaroo, in some interpretations, is believed to be a distorted, anglicized form of vaquero. These words are not random. They are evidence that American cowboy culture grew from Spanish-Mexican foundations. When a culture borrows vocabulary, it is usually borrowing more than words. It is borrowing concepts, techniques, traditions. So the cattle boom era becomes a kind of cultural translation process. The vaquero system becomes the cowboy system. Spanish terms become English slang. Spanish techniques become American ranch routine. Spanish gear becomes American iconography. And the cowboy becomes a new national symbol built on older Spanish roots. Now we should also acknowledge how the cowboy era created a myth of independence. Because in reality, the cowboy was often a worker in a large economic machine. He was hired, he was paid, he was part of a ranch operation. But American culture transformed him into a symbol of freedom. Why? Because the West itself symbolized freedom. Open land, wide skies, unsettled territory, no crowded cities, no rigid social hierarchies like Europe. The cowboy became the human face of this dream. And because the United States was expanding westward, the cowboy became a symbol of the nation's expansion and confidence. But again, Spain had already lived this frontier reality. Spain had already created frontier systems. Spain had already produced a mounted cattle-handling culture. The United States simply entered the stage later, amplified the scale, and turned the frontier into a national mythology. Now, the cattle boom also created another important development: competition. Because once ranching became profitable, it attracted many ranchers. Land became contested, water became contested, grazing rights became contested, and the open range became crowded. This led to conflicts between ranchers. Conflicts between farmers and ranchers, conflicts over fencing, conflicts over ownership. And eventually, the open range era began to decline. Fencing spread. Property boundaries hardened. The cowboy era of long cattle drives began to fade. But the myth did not fade. The cowboy became immortalized, not because the cowboy era lasted forever, but because it represented a dramatic moment in American expansion, and because Hollywood later turned it into entertainment. But before Hollywood, the vaquero tradition had already been living this life for centuries. The cowboy boom was short in historical terms. The vaquero foundation was long. Now, as the cowboy era grew, American culture began to shift the narrative. The cowboy was presented as an American hero. The West was presented as an American creation. Spanish and Mexican influences were often pushed into the background. This was not necessarily intentional in every case, but it became part of the national story. And that is why your documentary's Spanish bias is actually correcting a historical imbalance. Because Spain's contribution is too often treated as a footnote, but Spain's contribution was foundational. Spain returned the horse. Spain introduced cattle ranching on a massive scale. Spain created the vaquero. Spain spread ranch culture northward into Texas and California. Spain's vocabulary shaped the language of the West. Spain's equipment shaped the cowboy's toolkit. And Spain's frontier systems shaped the land long before American expansion. Without Spain, there is no cowboy era as we know it. Now, at this point in the documentary, we have reached the moment where the cowboy becomes visible to the world. The cattle drives, the boom towns, the railheads, the expansion, the national myth-making. But now we must confront the next major part of the story. Because as cowboy culture became popular, it began to evolve into entertainment. It became romanticized, it became mythologized, and this mythologizing process often simplified history. It often erased the Spanish and Mexican origins. It often turned a multicultural frontier world into a single-image stereotype. So the next chapter will focus on something extremely important: language, myth, and cultural memory, because one of the strongest pieces of evidence for Spanish influence is hidden in plain sight, in the words, in the place names, in the vocabulary of ranching, in the terminology of cowboy culture itself. And when you explore that language, the Spanish roots of the West become undeniable. Because the West speaks Spanish even when it pretends it doesn't. The cowboy had become a national icon. The cattle boom had turned ranching into industry. Railroads had connected the frontier to the cities, and the West had entered American imagination as a land of freedom, dust, and adventure. But beneath the American myth, a deeper story remained, a Spanish story, a Vaquero story, a story written not in English but in Spanish vocabulary, because even today the language of the cowboy carries the fingerprints of Spain.
And once you start noticing them, you realize something powerful. The West never stopped being Spanish, it simply changed flags.
In the next chapter, we explore the Spanish words, traditions, and cultural memory that prove cowboy culture is not purely American, but a continuation of a much older Spanish frontier world.
The Spanish words of the West.
There is a powerful rule in history. When a culture borrows the tools of another culture, it often borrows the words too. Because words are not just vocabulary, words are evidence. They are footprints, they are cultural fingerprints that survive even when borders change and empires collapse. And nowhere is this more visible than in the language of the American West. Because if you listen closely to cowboy culture, you will hear Spain, you will hear Spanish, not occasionally, constantly. The West speaks Spanish even when the world pretends it doesn't. This is one of the most convincing ways to prove that cowboy culture did not originate purely in the United States. Because the cowboy world is filled with Spanish-derived words. Words that describe ranching tools, techniques, cattle behavior, and horse life. And that is no accident. It is the mark of inheritance. It is the mark of origin. It is the linguistic shadow of the vaquero. Let us begin with the most obvious word of all. Vaquero. It means cow hand. It comes from vaca, cow, and it represents a complete ranch identity. Now in English, the word cowboy appears simple, cow plus boy. But the job itself did not emerge from English tradition. The job emerged from Spanish frontier ranching. The word cowboy is an English translation of a role that already existed in Spanish-speaking lands. This is why some historians argue that the American cowboy is essentially the English-speaking evolution of the vaquero. And language supports that argument strongly, because the cowboy world is filled with Spanish vocabulary absorbed into English. Consider the word ranch. Most people assume it is an English word, but the term is tied to Spanish roots. Ranching developed as a major system in Spanish America long before Anglo settlers expanded into the region. The ranch is not an invention of New England farmers. It is the frontier institution of Spanish and Mexican cattle culture. Now consider the word rodeo. Today, rodeo means sport. Bull riding, roping contests, barrel racing, but the word rodeo is Spanish. It comes from the verb rodear, to surround. In ranching terms, it refers to gathering cattle, rounding them up. That is the original rodeo, not entertainment. Work. A cattle roundup, a ranch necessity. And from this work tradition, modern rodeo sport was born. So even the cowboy's most famous entertainment is Spanish by name and origin. Now consider lasso. A cowboy cannot exist without a rope. The rope is the cowboy's signature tool. But the word lasso is Spanish. The tool itself is rooted in Spanish and Vaquero practice. The cowboy's most iconic object is literally named in Spanish. That alone should change the way we understand Western history. Now consider bronco. Today, bronco means a wild horse, difficult to ride. But bronco is Spanish in origin, and it reflects the Spanish frontier world where horses, especially semi-wild horses, were constantly being captured, trained, and broken for ranch work. The West did not invent the bronco problem. Spanish ranch culture lived it first. Now consider Mustang. The Mustang is perhaps the most iconic animal of the American West. Wild, free, untamed, racing across open plains. But Mustangs are descendants of Spanish horses, and the word itself is derived from Spanish roots. So even the wild horse mythology of America is Spanish in ancestry. This is one of the most powerful ironies of the West. America's symbol of freedom is descended from Spain's horses. Now consider corral. A corral is a cattle enclosure, central to ranch life. The word corral is Spanish, and the concept became widespread in ranching regions shaped by Spanish influence. Now consider stampede. The word stampede is commonly linked to Spanish roots, often connected to estampida, and it perfectly reflects ranching reality. Cattle panic, herd movement, chaos. The West needed a word for this because cattle culture was so central, and the word came through Spanish influence. Now consider buckaroo. This is where things get fascinating. Buckaroo is a word used in parts of the American West, especially in Nevada and California ranch culture. Many believe it is an anglicized form of vaquero, a distorted pronunciation that evolved as English-speaking ranchers adopted the word but reshaped it into their own accent. Vaquero, buckaroo. Whether every linguist agrees on the exact evolution, the cultural connection is clear. Even English slang for cowboy may be rooted in Spanish. Now consider cinch. A cinch is the strap that tightens a saddle onto a horse, one of the most basic pieces of riding equipment. The word comes from Spanish cincha. Again, and this is not a coincidence, this is proof that Western saddle culture entered English through Spanish-speaking ranch worlds. Now consider reata. In vaquero tradition, reata refers to a rawhide rope. In English cowboy culture, the word evolved into lariat, believed to come from la reata, the rope. This is another key example. The English cowboy did not invent the rope system. He inherited it, and the Spanish words traveled with it. Now consider chaps. The English word chaps is commonly connected to the Spanish word chaparreras, leg coverings used by riders to protect themselves from brush. Even the cowboy's protective gear carries Spanish roots. Now consider mesa, canyon, arroyo, adobe. These are not just cowboy words. They are landscape words, words describing the terrain of the Southwest. The fact that English speakers still use these words is a reminder that Spanish presence shaped not only ranching, but the entire geographic vocabulary of the region. The West is not only a land of American expansion, it is a land that already had names, Spanish terms, Spanish maps, Spanish identity, and those names survived. Now this is where language becomes more than a curiosity, it becomes historical proof. Because words do not spread unless the culture that created them had influence. English settlers did not borrow Spanish words because Spanish sounded exotic. They borrowed Spanish words because Spanish ranchers and vaqueros were already doing the work, and English-speaking newcomers had no choice but to adopt the existing system. Because if you want to ranch in Texas or California, you must learn how ranching is done. And ranching in those regions was shaped by Spanish and Mexican tradition, so English-speaking ranchers adopted the tools, and along with the tools came the words. This is the same process that happens in every cultural transfer. When a society imports a technology, it often imports the language attached to that technology. And ranching is a technology, the saddle is a technology, the rope is a technology, the corral is a technology, the cattle drive is a technology. And Spain's frontier world was one of the first to build this technology on a continental scale. Now, there is another layer of this story, because Spanish influence did not only survive in words, it survived in cultural rituals. Consider the tradition of cattle roundups, consider branding ceremonies, consider ranch festivals, consider horsemanship competitions. These traditions existed in Spanish America long before the United States made rodeo famous. In Mexico, the tradition of charreada, a formalized ranching sport, represents a deep cultural continuation of vaquero practices. The United States developed rodeo as its own form of competition, but the underlying idea of turning ranch work into sport already existed in Spanish tradition. This is why the cowboy is not an isolated phenomenon. He is part of a larger horse civilization that Spain carried into the Americas. Now, the language evidence also reveals something uncomfortable. American culture often wanted the cowboy to be purely American, purely Anglo, purely English, because the cowboy became part of American national identity. But language doesn't lie, language remembers, even when textbooks simplify, even when movies rewrite history, even when myths erase complexity. Words survive. And the West is full of Spanish words. This means that even when America claimed the West retained Spanish memory. The cowboy world was never purely American. It was built on Spanish foundations, and those foundations were so strong that they survived every political change. Spain lost its empire, Mexico lost territory. The United States expanded, but ranch culture remained. And ranch culture continued speaking Spanish. The West was not invented by the United States. The West was inherited by the United States, and inheritance leaves traces. Language is one of those traces, but language is not the only trace. We can also see Spanish influence in the very design of cowboy life, the ranch layout, the way cattle are gathered, the way horses are trained, the saddle horn, the rope technique, the spur style, the bridle style. These things were not invented in Kansas. They were inherited from vaquero tradition. Spain introduced the horse, but indigenous networks helped spread the horse across the continent. And in many cases, indigenous horse cultures developed in extraordinary ways. This does not diminish Spain's role, it actually strengthens it, because it shows how powerful Spain's introduction was. Spain did not simply change Spanish territory, Spain changed the entire continent. By bringing back the horse, Spain triggered a chain reaction that reshaped mobility, warfare, hunting, and trade far beyond Spanish control. This is the scale of Spain's impact. Now, as cowboy culture became mythologized in the late 1800s and early 1900s, much of this Spanish influence was hidden. The cowboy became a Hollywood invention. The cowboy became a national myth. The cowboy became a simplified hero figure. And the vaquero, the true ancestor, was often reduced to a side character or erased completely. But history is not a Hollywood script. History is a timeline. And the timeline proves that the vaquero existed first. Spain's ranch culture existed first. Spain's horse culture existed first. And the American cowboy is built on that foundation. This is why Spanish influence should not be treated as a footnote. It should be treated as the starting chapter, because without Spain, the cowboy era is unimaginable. The words of the West reveal the truth. The cowboy's vocabulary is Spanish. The cowboy's tools are Spanish-derived. The cowboy's techniques are inherited from vaqueros. And the horse that made the West possible was returned by Spain. The West may have become an American legend, but the roots of that legend ride back to Spain.
The cowboy is a Spanish legacy and a continental fusion.
By this point, the truth should be impossible to ignore. The cowboy, one of the most famous figures in world history, one of the most recognizable symbols of the United States, is not purely American in origin. He's not a spontaneous invention of Texas. He's not a sudden creation of the 1800s. He is not a product of Hollywood imagination alone. The cowboy is real, but the cowboy is also inherited.
And that inheritance begins with Spain.
The West, as we understand it, is not simply an American story. It is a Spanish story that America later adopted and amplified. And this is where the final chapter must deliver its most important message. The cowboy is not a myth, but the cowboy's origin story has been simplified. The true story is deeper, older, and far more interesting. Because the cowboy is not the beginning of Western history. The cowboy is the result of Western history, and the beginning of that story is Spanish. Let's begin with the most foundational truth of all, the horse. Without the horse, there is no cowboy culture, no cattle drives, no mounted ranching system, no open-range empire, no rodeo, no western saddle, no frontier silhouette. The horse is the foundation of the West, and horses did not exist in North America when Europeans arrived. They had gone extinct thousands of years earlier. This is one of the most astonishing facts in natural history. The horse evolved in North America, then disappeared, and then returned, carried across the ocean by Spanish ships. This means the horse that became the engine of the American West is not an American invention. It is a Spanish reintroduction. Spain did not merely bring back an animal. Spain brought back a civilization-changing force. Spain gave North America back its horse age. And once horses returned, the land became something new. Mobility increased, territory became reachable, distance became conquerable, economies expanded, and a continent-wide transformation began. But the horse alone does not create cowboy culture.
Because a horse is only an animal.
What matters is what humans build around it. And Spain did not bring horses alone. Spain brought a system. Spain brought ranching. Spain brought cattle. Spain brought land management traditions. Spain brought riding techniques. Spain brought equipment. Spain brought vocabulary. Spain brought a frontier economy. And Spain brought the vaquero. The vaquero is the missing key to understanding the cowboy, because the vaquero is the true ancestor. The cowboy is the later adaptation. The vaquero was not a fictional character. He was a real working professional, developed in Spanish America to solve a frontier problem. How do you manage cattle on open land? How do you control livestock across endless range? How do you create wealth from wilderness? Spain had the answer. Ranches, horses, mounted cattle handlers, the vaquero. And this tradition did not remain isolated. It spread northward into Texas, California, New Mexico, and Arizona. Long before American settlers arrived, Spanish and Mexican ranch culture had already shaped these regions. So when Americans entered the Southwest, they entered a world already organized.
Already ranching, already riding, already using ropes, corrals, saddle horns, spurs, and brands.
Already speaking Spanish ranch vocabulary.
Already living a cowboy-like lifestyle.
The Americans did not invent the West from nothing. They stepped into a West that Spain had already begun building. Now here is where myth begins to form. Because later, in the late 1800s, the United States experienced a cattle boom. Railroads expanded, eastern markets demanded beef, cattle drives became massive, cowboys became a visible workforce. And because this happened during America's period of national expansion, the cowboy became linked to American identity. The cowboy became the symbol of manifest destiny, the symbol of frontier strength, the symbol of American independence. But symbolism is not the same as origin. The cowboy became famous under the American flag, but the cowboy's roots were already embedded in Spanish soil. This is why the cowboy's equipment tells a Spanish story. The lasso, the rodeo, the bronco, the mustang, the corral, the cinch, the ranch itself, even the landscape vocabulary, mesa, canyon, arroyo, reminds us that the West was mapped and named in Spanish long before English-speaking settlers arrived. In other words, even today, the cowboy's world speaks Spanish, because Spanish culture was not a visitor in the West, it was a builder. And now we must confront the question that defines the myth. Why then does the world still treat the cowboy as purely American? The answer is not complicated, because America told the story louder. The United States grew into a global superpower. American literature, American journalism, and American film exported the cowboy worldwide. Hollywood created the Western genre. Dime novels spread romantic cowboy stories. Buffalo Bill's Wild West shows turned frontier life into traveling entertainment. And over time, the cowboy became a global icon of America itself. But in this process, something happened. The cowboy was separated from his roots. The vaquero became invisible. Spanish influence became background decoration. Mexican ranch culture was reduced to stereotypes, and the West was rewritten as if it had always been American. This is not unique in history. This happens whenever a new power inherits an older system. The inheritor often claims ownership. The inheritor becomes the face of the tradition. But the tradition existed long before the inheritor arrived. And that is exactly what happened with the American West. The United States inherited Spanish frontier culture, then expanded it, then mythologized it, then sold it to the world as an American creation. But the roots were still there, and they remain there. Now, at this point, a responsible historical narrative must make one thing clear. This is not about denying American cowboy identity. The American cowboy is real. The cattle drives were real. The railhead towns were real. The open range was real. The conflicts were real. The hardships were real. The American cowboy became a unique cultural figure shaped by American economic forces. But he did not emerge from a vacuum. He emerged from a Spanish-Mexican frontier tradition. So the correct story is not Spain invented the cowboy. The correct story is deeper. Spain created the conditions that made the cowboy possible. Spain brought back the horse. Spain introduced cattle ranching systems. Spain built the vaquero tradition. Mexico preserved and expanded it. Then the United States absorbed it, scaled it, and made it famous. This is the full sequence. Now we also must address another important truth. The West was not shaped only by Spain and America. It was shaped by indigenous peoples as well. Because while Spain reintroduced horses, indigenous nations adopted them rapidly. In many regions, horses spread beyond Spanish settlements through trade, theft, and exchange networks. Indigenous horse cultures transformed the Great Plains. They changed hunting, they changed warfare, they changed mobility, they changed tribal economies. In other words, Spain triggered the return of the horse, but indigenous societies became major drivers of the horse's spread and cultural impact. This means the West was not created by one civilization alone. It was a fusion. But the spark, the reintroduction, was Spanish. And without Spain, the horse does not return. Without the horse, none of the later developments occur. So Spain remains the starting point of the chain reaction. Now we must confront the second myth of cowboy history. The myth that cowboy culture is purely white and Anglo. This is not historically accurate. The West was multicultural. Mexican vaqueros were central. Indigenous horse cultures were central. Black cowboys existed in significant numbers, especially after the Civil War. Immigrants entered ranching regions and contributed to frontier economies. The cowboy world was never one-dimensional. Hollywood simplified it, but reality was more complex. And once again, Spanish influence helps correct the record. Because the vaquero tradition itself reflects a multicultural society. Spanish settlers indigenous workers, and mixed communities shaping ranch life together. The vaquero was often mestizo. The vaquero was often part of a frontier society where identity was shaped by skill and survival more than by politics. And this multicultural frontier world is closer to historical truth than any Hollywood version. Now we must address the third myth. The myth that cowboy culture was born from violence and lawlessness. Yes, violence existed. Yes, the frontier could be brutal. But the core of cowboy culture was not chaos. It was work. Cowboy life was economic. It was seasonal. It was structured around herds, grazing land, water sources, branding schedules, and long-distance drives. Cowboys were laborers in an agricultural industry. They were not all gunfighters. They were not all outlaws. The cowboy's true world was not the saloon. It was the range. It was the dust. It was the saddle. It was the herd. And this is where Spanish history actually gives a more accurate picture. Because Spanish ranching culture was highly organized, it was not random frontier violence. It was a system of land grants, ranchos, livestock management, and labor tradition. The vaquero world was built on practical structure.
And the American cowboy inherited that structure.
So the West was not born as anarchy, it was born as a ranch economy. Now at this stage, we can also confront the most important truth of all. The cowboy is not an American beginning. The cowboy is an American ending. He is the final form of a long evolution. A long evolution that began in Spain, crossed the Atlantic, matured in Mexico, expanded across the Southwest, and exploded into American industry during the cattle boom era. That is the true story. And once you understand it, the cowboy becomes even more fascinating. Because he becomes a symbol not only of America, but of global cultural transfer. He represents how empires export traditions, how frontier economies create professions, how tools and language spread across borders, how identity evolves through inheritance. The cowboy is not merely a man on horseback. He is the product of centuries of history.
And Spain is the beginning of that history.
Now, as we close this documentary, we must end with a final image. Not a Hollywood image, not a myth, but a real one. Picture a vaquero riding across open land in the Spanish frontier of North America. The sun is high, the terrain is harsh, cattle move slowly across the brush, a rope hangs from the saddle, the horse is trained, calm, responsive, the rider moves with quiet control. He is not performing, he is working. This is the original silhouette of the West. This is the first true cowboy-like figure in North America. Not the American cowboy of the 1870s, but the vaquero of Spanish America. The vaquero who carried Spain's ranch tradition into the New World. The vaquero who shaped the land long before the United States claimed it. And then centuries later, picture an American cowboy driving cattle toward a railhead. The same rope, the same saddle horn, the same spur, the same dust, the same open land, the same survival logic. Different language, different flag, different national story, but the same inherited tradition. That is the reality. The cowboy is not an isolated invention. He is a descendant, a continuation, a living echo of Spanish frontier civilization. So when people say the cowboy is purely American, the correct response is not anger. The correct response is history, because history shows us something far more interesting. The cowboy is a Spanish legacy made famous by America. A tradition born in Spain, matured in Mexico, and mythologized in the United States. A symbol that belongs not only to one nation, but to an entire continent's transformation.
And if we tell the story honestly, the cowboy does not lose his greatness.
He becomes greater, because now he represents something larger than myth. He represents the real story of how civilizations shape one another, how animals reshape continents, how technology becomes culture, how language becomes memory, how the past survives in plain sight, and how Spain, often overlooked, helped create the very foundation of the American West. So the next time you see the silhouette of a cowboy against the sunset, remember, that silhouette is older than the United States. It carries the shadow of Spain. It carries the legacy of the vaquero. and it carries the hoofbeats of the horses Spain brought back to a continent that had once lost them. The West was not invented in one moment. It was built across centuries, and at the beginning of that long road, riding into the unknown, was Spain